You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 298 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's a beautiful night for some playoff baseball in Chicago.
There is no playoff baseball in Chicago to be had. We will talk about and recap the season that was for the Cubs. I'm sure we'll find some time to make fun of the White Sox and Cardinals along the way. And we definitely have hey, we just got past our birthday, so happy birthday to you. And
to you too.
Thank you. And we are now into the off season. We'll talk a little bit about the playoffs. First, the wild card round is over. I do want to get your thoughts on that. And to help us unpack all of the baseball talk, the Cubs talk, the season recap at large, longtime friend of the program, you know him from his fantastic work over at the Cubs Insider, Evan Altman. Thanks for taking time to talk all things baseball with us tonight.
Well, I'm happy to join you, gentlemen, especially after we are into October. The Cubs won more baseball games in October than the Cardinals did this year, which is kind of commonplace actually since 2015. But it's the Cubs didn't make it to the playoffs, but they still won as many playoff games as the Cardinals, and that makes me happy.
Yeah, definitely was. Let's before we talk about the Cubs season, let's talk a little bit about that. We enjoyed watching the Cardinals get ousted in the playoffs by Kyle Schwarber and the Philadelphia Phillies. That was fantastic. But your thoughts overall, Evan, we'll start with you. Your thoughts overall on the new playoff format, the wild card round being now a best of three. I think we all agree the one-game coin flip was always not ideal. What do you think of the expanded playoffs with the best of three format?
You know, it's a little bit weird. I think naturally I like it a little bit better when my team is not in it because
Sure.
I don't care. You know, it's like, but there was nothing more nerve-wracking than trying to, pull for your team in a one-gamer like that. Like that is, and I go back to thinking like just how, and it's really, really cool too at times because I'm going all the way, we go back to when the Cubs played the Giants for the play-in.
Sure.
Back in 98, and and then playing the Pirates in 2015, and I don't think we could put the series against the game against the Rockies in quite the same, but they had to play a game 163 and then they had to play the Rockies, and when you have that one gamer, man, it's so different. But I actually don't think I fit with. It seems like most people, not even necessarily purists, don't really like letting the extra teams in. I don't really mind it. I do enjoy having a 3-game series. I think it's at least a little bit more indicative of talent, and you do get that prolonged a little bit. I like that it, kind of rewards those top teams a little to have some of that bye and really set up their rotation a little bit better. So yeah, I don't mind it at all. And again, not only did the Cardinals lose, but the Mets also lost. And so I think that's maybe coloring my perception a little bit because I was very happy with the results.
Pat, I know you were as well happy with those results.
Well, at least in the National League, it was pretty evident the best teams won. So,
Yeah, the watching the Mets collapse and them tracking it back to being swept by the Cubs, is
nice.
Was a pretty positive way to finish the season there, and it does put a little extra importance to the regular season because you don't want to play in that series. You want to be the Atlanta Braves and get the bye into the actual divisional round. So
maybe the Mets should have tried to improve their team at the All-Star break.
They could have used a Wilson Contreras or an Ian Happ in that lineup, huh?
Sure. Yeah.
But they had Michael Givens. Come on, guys. I mean, they made
Yeah.
a trade with the Cubs. They're just not a real big one because they were still afraid that they would get burned like they did with Pete Crow Armstrong. And that's it. It baffles me that they went out and spent all that money on these guys to get Max Scherzer. And, they've got DeGrom in there, and they went out and they got a bunch of other kind of mid-tier guys. They've got this huge payroll, and yet they're so concerned, despite the fact that they have the richest owner in professional sports, or at least in Major League Baseball. They've clearly shown the willingness and ability to spend a ton of money, and yet they're worried about offering anybody better than like their 6th or 7th ranked prospect to be able to have a better shot at a World Series. It is complete malpractice, but it's absolutely not surprising that the Mets did it.
It's called going halfway in. It's a unique concept. It doesn't work, and they learned the hard way.
Yeah, it was definitely, when you look at the playoff landscape, especially in the National League, these are all teams that were trying, though, right? You can count the teams that were trying when you were looking at the offseason moves, and the teams that were trying all made the playoffs. And there's something to be said that if you don't try, there's no way you're just gonna you're not gonna Brewers your way in. They did not make it. But the teams that went out and made moves and tried, the least
the Brewers gave up their closer right at the All-Star break and were punished for it appropriately.
Yeah, so it's good to see, and you'd like to see, and you'd like to think that the Cubs are getting close to the point where they want to try. And based off of today's Jed Hoyer press conference, I don't know. He said a whole lot of nothing for me. Pat, we'll start with you. Your thoughts on what you heard from the Jed Hoyer press conference today? I didn't hear much.
I heard that he's hoping that they can get lucky with some mid-range free agent acquisitions, and that'll be enough to help carry him into a wild card series next year. Much
They
like
said
the
they
teams
want to
we
be
just
competitive.
discussed.
They did say they want to be competitive.
But he also, and who knows, maybe he's just messing with us, but he also indicated reticence toward actually getting a really good player, an all-star, elite player, because it's expensive. Which it is. But the problem, of course, is that without elite players, teams generally don't win, right? Like, it's a fallacy to think that you're going to win a World Series with a bunch of, solid to slightly above average guys. You need elite players in order to win. And, you're in that spot where we were hoping, and many people were hoping, the Cubs would go out and be aggressive and get a Trey Turner. Maybe they will. Somebody of that ilk, to play in the middle infield for the Cubs and maybe a frontline starter. But if Hoyer is going to be afraid of paying a large amount of money to do so and therefore doesn't do it, well, that's going to be disappointing. Based on the logic of his comments today, if he had been in charge of the Cubs in 2014, it doesn't sound like the Cubs ever would have signed John Lester. Like, that would not be a deal he would make, from the sound of it, because that's not the buy cheap intelligent spending that he was mimicking today. So,
intelligent spending is a scary term there.
Yeah, because free agent spending isn't intelligent, right? Free agent spending is probably overpaying in the long haul in order to get a guy who can help you win right now. Because no matter how deep your farm system is, I've never seen a team that's been able to call up 25 players in a 2-year stretch and have them all be superstars and win a World Series. It just doesn't work like that. You need to augment, your younger players with veteran stars, and veteran stars apparently aren't cheap because they're stars, and stars get paid more. So, that's it feels a little naive to think otherwise. But they mentioned I think Bryce Harper was one of the ones. Did he mention it specifically, or was it just brought up that was one of the types of contracts where teams are going to be feeling down the road the pain. But I look at Bryce Harper's last 4 years, and I think, wow, that's exactly what the Cubs need. A guy who,
it's for sure what they needed in 2018. Yeah.
Well, they could have used him in 2019, 2020,
Yep.
21, and this year. Like he's had a great 4 years. This was his worst year. His OPS was 877, right? His worst of the 4 years. I look at the Cubs' OPSs and I'm like, huh. The only Cub with an OPS over 800 was Wilson Contreras, and they're going to let him walk for the 68th pick in the draft. So, you gotta at some point you gotta lay down your cards and try, and that's expensive. But they have a lot of money, which is nice, right?
Well,
so it's not expensive to them.
Yeah, and I've been told by Tom Ricketts, I've heard in his interviews that Jed has the checkbook. He can spend what he needs to get it done. Evan, did you hear anything today to make you feel better that they could be competitive in 2023?
I didn't hear much, and I I think I agree with some of the folks out there, and I said Hoyer says so little, and always has. Like that's kind of been his. Like Theo Epstein always did the exec speak thing, but you sort of felt like you could track a general sense of direction with him, whereas I feel like Hoyer just sort of strings words together that typically don't have a ton of meaning, and it's just like a bunch of the corporate cliches, right? He speaks in tropes, and there's a way that you can look at it. I think it's very easy with the way that he says things to ascribe kind of whatever your own thoughts are. If you were bullish on the Cubs, maybe going out and getting aggressive and spending some money, I think you could interpret that as such, because in theory, you could say it's really intelligent spending to go and pay Jacob deGrom $45 million a year for 3 years, right? And try to really leverage some of that, or to give, who knows, to give $40 million to Justin Verlander or something like that, which again, it seems wild to pay that much, but you've reduced your long-term risk, right? I think that's the one thing we've heard from Hoyer over and over. And he's even said they're willing to spend more on average annual value. That's what they did with Marcus Stroman, but over a reduced period of time, right? Most of these guys, most of those in Stroman's kind of that tier, we're looking for maybe 5 years, and he's got 3 and possibly only 2, depending on how it works. So there are ways you could look at it. I know the talk about, he was asked about Nico Horner possibly moving over, and while Hoyer certainly didn't say, oh yeah, we're definitely gonna go get one of those top free agent shortstops, and we're definitely gonna move Horner over, but it sounds like that conversation has maybe at least been had, right? Or that they've thought about it. We've heard reports about them targeting some top pitchers. So, at the same time though, he could be meaning that they're not going to buy anybody at the top end, that they're going to look in the middle of the market, which we've seen far too often before, and that really what they're going to do is wait and try to get value at the last possible second, which is absolutely no way to be competitive. So,
right.
You could fall again. I think you can interpret what he said however you really want to, and actually find a way to make that make sense.
Let's take a look at, before we get into any, we've done the speculation podcast. We'll have some more as we get closer to the winter beatings, but now I wanted to take the opportunity to look back. Let's take a look back on this 2022 season for the Cubs. And when we look at right before the lockout, the Cubs went out and they signed Yan Gomes to a 2-year contract. They signed Clint Frazier. They signed Hermosillo. They signed Marcus Stroman to a 3-year contract. Of those deals, obviously Marcus Stroman being the key one there. What are your guys' thoughts on year 1 of Marcus Stroman as a Cub? Evan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it looked a lot better with the way he finished it. It was certainly interesting to me for someone who had spoken so highly about the reasons he wanted to come to Chicago, loving the city, wanted to play in front of those fans, and the way he continually praised the fans and really the experience of pitching at Wrigley. But up until really his last 3 starts at home, he was terrible at Wrigley relative to how he pitched on the road, which is kind of an odd vibe to me. You if we look back at guys like Javi Baez, or we talk about Contreras and people who kind of fed off that crowd and who had issues with the 2020 season with no fans in the stands, I felt like Stroman would be a guy kind of like that. But had a hard time, I think, establishing his rhythm between the lockout. And then I know he had some mechanical issues. He had a couple of injuries that were in there. But once he caught his groove, I thought that came together really, really well. In hindsight, I think this will look much better if the Cubs do go out and actually get like a true number 1 type pitcher, and Stroman can slide into more of that 2 or 3 spot. With him kind of essentially being the de facto ace and kind of being that big signing, I do think that the hype kind of hurt a little bit. But again, overall, I think it was a really, really solid signing that can look even better in time.
Pat, what do you think? Your thoughts on Marcus Stroman? I agree. It feels a lot better with that the way he finished the year.
Sure, and I think that happens a lot when players switch teams. There's a little bit of an adjustment at the beginning. I thought he pitched fine. He had some bad luck, I think, early in the year too. Frankly, his ERA might have been higher than it should have been. He would hit some games where he pitched really well, and then either the bullpen or he at the end when he was tired gave up some extra runs to make it look uglier. So I had no qualms about that. I think he was a good addition. We were hoping he would pitch well, and I think he did pitch pretty well. And now they only and coupled with Justin Steele's emergence as a pitcher, you look at those guys and think, wow, if that's your number 2 and 3, you might have something there.
Yeah, and the other big signing, obviously, Seiya Suzuki got a 5-year contract coming out of the lockout. So after 99 days of the owners locking out the players, new CBA is agreed to. The season would start on time. Well, it would start on April 7th, but it would allow for all 162 games to be played. Coming right out of there, a flurry of free agent activity. Seiya Suzuki getting the 5-year deal from the Cubs. Pat, your thoughts on Suzuki's rookie season? Is it what you expected, or were you expecting more? Speaking of guys who need an adjustment.
Yeah, it was up and down for sure. Was I expecting more? I guess probably, to be honest, yes. I think most people were, frankly. Certainly after the first week of the season,
Sure.
All I heard about was not just rookie of the year, but MVP, right? I mean, so I think people set the expectations pretty high. And that, of course, didn't really come to fruition. I mean, he missed a month with an injury. He had a stretch where he was really bad offensively. And then he picked it up later in the year and finished, I guess he finished the year in decent shape. Given the fact that he missed 50 games, he missed a third of the season. And he did strike out kind of a ton, but again, a lot of that seems, speaking of adjustments, he really seemed to get jobbed a lot on balls and strikes. He reminded me of Kyle Schwarber a little bit, the guys who take pitches that are off the plate, they get called strikes. It seems like it happened to the 2 of those guys more than pretty much anybody else. But hopefully as he becomes a sophomore next year, that'll be reduced. And I'd like to see him maybe hit for a little bit more pop in year 2. And then, defensively, it'd be nice if his defensive numbers would improve a little bit. That was sort of the surprise of it all, I guess, I think there was a thought that his defensive numbers would be very good, and at least from a sabermetric standpoint, they were not. So, but all in all, it wasn't a bad season. If he were on a team like the 2020 Cubs, a playoff team, he would have been a very valuable addition, a very valuable member. But on this team, it seemed like it was, there wasn't much. By the time he started playing well, there wasn't anything to play for. So it never really kind of synced up.
So is Seiya Suzuki part of your core, Evan, with Nico Horner?
Yeah, I think so. I think again, you talk about somebody who kind of like Stroman, he finished hot. Suzuki, that is, started hot, finished hot. But it's also interesting when we talk about a guy making these adjustments, and you could kind of see a lot of that happening in real time. And if you look at, again, he got off to a great start, kind of faded a little bit, had the injury, then got really hot again after the injury, then faded a little bit, then took about a week off or so for the birth of his child, then came back and finished the season really hot after that. So you look at, again, the season in Japan is a little bit shorter, adjusting just culturally, physically, all these different things. Again, adjusting to a strike zone that was apparently just built to screw him over. That wasn't very helpful. The velocity, things like that. And I think psychologically, right? You talk about, again, with his child being born, well, he's got his pregnant wife back in Japan while he's playing. And certainly, that's not the easiest thing in the world to do while also adjusting to an entirely new country. So I think he's one of those that's really going to, next season be able to establish more of a routine, get into that a little bit better. But I was really happy to see those adjustments he made. And I think, again, with a little bit more, I guess, just familiarity, right, with the MLB travel schedule and everything like that. I think that's going to help him tremendously, and kind of being part of that moving forward. Ideally, right, the Cubs kind of balance out that outfield a little bit better. I do think, defensively, I was a little bit disappointed, although at the same time, you look at how many different guys were playing center field. Really, and oddly enough, like Michael Hermosillo was about the only one who could do so very well, at least at a high level, and he was only hitting like $115. So it was kind of a rotating door out there. I'd be really interested to see what happens, because we know at some point, might not be next year, but soon enough, they're going to have an elite defensive center fielder out there. I think that'll clean up a whole lot from what we've seen, because it's been a while. Dexter Fowler was not an elite defensive player. Got helped by playing at Wrigley versus some of the other places he had been. But normally they've been looking at Jason Hayward out there. So if nothing else, it was a big upgrade offensively out and right. So I'm excited to see what he can do moving forward.
Here's a fun fact for you guys. In games that Suzuki played, the Cubs were 50 and 61. In those 50 wins, he had an OPS of 859. And in those 61 losses, his OPS was 696. So about 165 points difference in his OPS in team wins versus team losses. So to the extent that, the Cubs, not completely, but the Cubs seemed to play a lot better when he was playing better.
Fun fact about the Cubs schedule, they were 37 and 44 at home and the same record on the road. 37 and 44 for the Cubs. So no, it seems like every time I went, I sat through a loss. That's for sure. But just as many victories at home as on the road. April was April, May, June. They got off to these were all losing months for the Cubs. July, another losing month, and then you got to the trade deadline, and we did multiple podcasts on what happened at the trade deadline. Borderline malpractice, not trading not trading Wilson Contreras, even if you don't get what you want for him, or what you thought the market should have been, and the way that they handled that situation. Looking back, that trade deadline has only got worse as the season ends, and we look back on what happened. That's you touched on it a little bit at the top there, Evan. That the Mets didn't want to get burned, and it seemed like once the Padres were out of it, the Cubs were left holding Wilson Contreras for a qualifying offer.
That's what happens when you got 15 teams tanking at the All-Star break.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's there's a So the All-Star, so the trade deadline was tough for the Cubs for a different reason than the year prior.
They did get, to the extent that he continues to pitch well, they got an interesting guy in was it Hayden Wisniewski, right?
Hayden
I
Wisniewski.
mean, he started 4 games, pitching 33 innings, so it's still awfully early. But he looked very sharp. They gave up a lot to get him, but he seemed to pitch well. So if he's the kind of guy who you could count on to be ideally a 4th or 5th starter next year, ideally a 4th starter, right? Because they gave up Scott Efros, who we really liked. But that could, in conjunction with Stroman and Steele, be a nice middle of the rotation.
Do you see Wisniewski being part of the rotation next season, Evan?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of it depends on what they go out and do. I mean, we've heard, and Hoyer kind of addressed it briefly, the idea of maybe Drew Smiley, and I can't imagine both Smiley and Wade Miley coming back, although they hold an option on Smiley. And, I feel a little bit better about Miley. Seems like a really great dude who everybody loves, but, unless he's going to take a really, really minimal contract and be willing to move to the bullpen, I think what we're going to see them do is try to stock up as much depth as possible, and maybe work with some of those other younger pitchers who are coming up, kind of like what we saw with Justin Steele and Keegan Thompson last year, although I'd still like to see Thompson kind of working out of the bullpen moving forward. But Adbert Alzolay is another one, right? Like, bring them along slowly. Don't try to push these guys into the rotation immediately. And Wisniewski originally was going to work in that role, right? He was piggybacking with Miley. And what I would like to see is for the Cubs to use Wisniewski, whether it's as the primary starter or in that kind of long piggyback role. And effectively, you're using 2 starters in one game, to give you 4 or 5 innings apiece. You're saving your bullpen. You're giving experience to one of these young guys. You're changing looks, whether you're going lefty, righty, you're going kind of a soft tosser with a hard thrower, whatever the case may be, and giving teams different looks. We see that a ton with Tampa Bay, right? They've found a ton of success by kind of mixing and matching pitchers of different styles and really leaning on some unknowns and some young guys. Not that I want the Cubs to emulate, kind of the cheapness that we see, the shoestring budgets in Tampa. But if they can do that with some of these young pitchers that we've seen develop, I like Wisniewski as somebody. He's got a really cerebral approach to the game that I like, and his stuff I think plays up really, really well and has the potential to get even better. That slider is just, it's incredible. And if he can figure out the fastball a little bit better and continue to locate that, get a little bit more movement on it, I think he is a guy who can easily stick in the middle of that rotation for several years here.
I agree, and I think with Ohtani pitching every 6th day, it'll right, it'll work well to piggyback some of our starters at the back end of the rotation. Let me ask you this, Evan. We talked about this on the podcast a couple times, but while very excited about the surprise season of an Adrian Sampson, does a 31-year-old Adrian Sampson next year start 19 games and have an ERA of 3.11 for the Cubs, or is that some production they're going to have to try to make up somehow?
As much as I would go into every one of his starts saying, okay, here's when the other shoe drops, right? Something is he's going to revert back to what his numbers were. And then every time he goes out there and sort of, he did last year what everybody kind of almost what Kyle Hendricks did maybe his second year, right? Where it was like, oh, there's no way he can keep this up. And sure enough, he kept doing it, but
he's 6 years older.
Right. And yeah. And I'm just not sold on that ability to maintain it, or at least not to the extent that I would, although this is what's funny is I did have somebody comment on a piece, I'd said, well, if the Cubs can go after this or this, and I'd mentioned Jacob deGrom, and somebody's like, I'd rather save that money for something else and give that spot to Sampson. I'm like, let's see. If you have a chance to get Jacob deGrom, you go get Jacob deGrom, right? I mean,
Sampson turned 31 3 days ago. I didn't realize that. Happy birthday!
Oh, he's with us. The birthday.
Yeah,
weekend.
it's a 789.
That's
right.
But I just, I don't trust. I wouldn't trust it enough to say we're going to even pencil you in for a spot. To me, it's I think he's maybe earned a spot at the table on the pitching staff. If things fall a certain way, if things don't add 2 more starters, sure, he's got to roll. Otherwise, hey, work as a long man, work as depth if they need a 6th starter.
I feel like in the modern era of baseball, having a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th guy option at starting pitcher be people like Sampson and Alzolay and Thompson and people like, that's the kind of depth that in order to win a lot of games over the course of the regular season, that especially in the NL Central, and avoid a 3-game wild card stint, that's what you need. You need when injuries come, which they inevitably do, you need guys who can come in and pitch well, and things always go wrong and things always go sideways, and you're going to need depth. And it's much better to bring in players who, I feel like the Dodgers are really good at this. They'll work guys in slowly, pitch them, like you say, out of the pen as long relievers, or they bring them up for spot starts, and they're really good. Or like Jose Urias is a good example, somebody who just they kind of slowly worked in, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, now he's ready, and boom, he was amazing. And it'd be nice if the Cubs had that level of depth. And usually, frankly, you can only do that if you have younger guys who are under your control, right? Like you can't do that with a bunch of veterans because, Drew Smiley's not gonna be like, yeah, sure, stick me in Iowa and bring me up when you need me, right? Like that's not gonna happen. But for the younger guys, where you have either options on them or you've got more team control, it's a strategy that's worked for a number of other teams with deeper farm systems.
And didn't the Dodgers do that with Dustin May as well when he was first coming? And then again, you talk about a guy who's just got electric stuff, right? And so, yeah, I would love to see them just have the, we talk about the joke about too many shortstops or whatever. I'd love to see them have too many starters, right? And have to find because they've always found ways to patch together that bullpen. But if you've got some of these hard throwing guys, we saw Jeremiah Estrada briefly, Danis Correa is another guy who could be coming up. And we're talking about pitchers who have, triple digit fastballs and just nasty sliders. But I think, again, with somebody like Wisniewski, the other thing you can do, right, because he's even admitted he needs some work on his fastball. Justin Steele, we talked about him breaking out. He still wants to work on that changeup. But a lot of times with these young guys coming up, you can kind of hide some of those little flaws, or if they don't have that full kind of starters pitch mix yet, you can allow them to come up, lean into their strengths when it's over shorter stints and let them go just 2 or 3 innings, face the road or face the lineup once, right, and then move on from it.
And then let Keegan Thompson come in and pitch 3 innings. That's a workable possibility, I think.
Well, and again, you don't have to have all kind of. We've seen, they've had some issues with the bullpen after they traded all those guys. But when you have Wisniewski going 4 or 5 innings at the end of a Wade Miley start, or Keegan Thompson coming in and throwing 3, you don't really have to worry about using the bullpen that much, or if it gets overworked in a long stretch of games in a row. So having that kind of depth really helps. And then when you're a good team, I think that's the big difference. It's great. I thought Adrian Sampson did really, really well, and that was great to have on a team that won 74 games or whatever. But if you were trying to win 90 games, well, you're going to need to have more firepower.
And I think also it was fairly evident watching this team, especially during the losing streaks, not having an ace on the staff, not having somebody who can break those losing streaks and who can, who you think of when you watch these 3-game wild card series and you look at the playoff baseball and how important it is to have just a shutdown pitcher. That's something that I think the Cubs need to figure out how to address. And, that's the very difficult thing to do internally, obviously. And it's going to be difficult to do it in free agency if you want to spend intelligently, because ace starters are not quote intelligent, spending from a inexpensive standpoint. And then your next option is maybe you reach out to some teams on some pitchers who are arbitration eligible and basically try to squeeze some of the poorer teams into giving you a very good player, a Pablo Lopez or somebody from Miami, right, in exchange for some prospects, and you trade up that way. I mean, if you don't want to spend the money, that's your only real surefire way to do that, to achieve that.
Well, based on the way the Cubs finished this season, thanks to performances like Hayden Wisniewski, they went on a record pace here, closing out. They were one of the hottest teams, couldn't lose down the stretch, and they ended up as a 74 win team, even with that hot September into October. The Cubs pushed their draft lottery odds all the way down to 1.1%.
Yeah.
Based on that performance, it turns out the Cubs were a bad team, but nowhere near as bad as 11 other teams in front of them. These teams were just hideous. The Nationals, the A's, the Pirates, the Reds, Royals, Tigers, Rangers, Rockies, Marlins, Angels, and the Diamondbacks all finished with worse records ahead of the Cubs and will all have a better shot at the number one overall pick in the draft lottery. The Nationals can pick no worse than 7th. This will be the first year of the MLB draft lottery. So,
can I just say that there were 4 teams that lost over 100 games, and there were 5 more teams that lost 93 to 99. So it's basically 9 teams, almost a third of all of baseball, lost 93 or more games. That's pitiful. In terms of, that's one of the things the players were arguing about with the owners in the last negotiations. But I think it's bad for baseball when you have this sort of disparate level of ability on teams. I mean, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 100-win teams this year.
Do you remember when losing 100 games was a big deal?
Yeah, I remember losing 100 games was horrendous. And
4 teams did that this year. Unbelievable.
Yeah. And I guess the worst part is they're trying to do it now. I feel like the Cubs have created a monster with the with the rebuild that they did, and now other teams are trying to emulate it. Only, ask a Pirates fan what that's like, because they've emulated the losing. Right? They've got the 100 losses down. The problem is they never do the rebuild and the winning part. So that's the trick. But I don't like the way that has that works in baseball. It just seems counterproductive, and it leads to a lot of cities having really no meaningful baseball after the All-Star break, which is a shame.
Well, and what's funny is the whole idea of this draft lottery was supposed to help curb that, and I'm still struggling to understand how that's possible. What was the thinking? And I mean, I guess, depending on where you fall, you can't, get a top 3 pick 2 years in a row and that sort of thing. But I don't know, unless you turn it into something like the NFL and allow them to start trading draft picks to where, a team could trade down out of that number 1 spot and pick up 4 other really good draft picks, which, for all intents and purposes is probably better for most teams, given the way baseball players mature and then eventually impact their teams. Like, I just don't, I'm struggling at all to understand how this lottery concept curbs tanking, because as you just mentioned, it certainly didn't this year. I mean, maybe in the future when they can't get the top pick a couple years in a row, but come on, most of those are really bad teams and have been for a long time.
Well, and it's not the NHL, it's not the NBA, and it's not the NFL, where the number 1 pick is, how many times is the number 1 pick not panned out for MLB? It's like there's
you want to go through the Cubs first round draft picks over the last 30 years? I mean, we could play this game all night long.
Right. It's different. Like it's like if Chris Bryant was not a number 1 pick for the Cubs. He was not the number 1 pick overall.
Right.
And
no, the number 1 pick was terrible.
Yeah, and so it's not like there's even like a generational talent they're all trying to tank for. Can you imagine when some phenom is going to be the consensus number 1 pick, and then you'll see some real tanking. It's not gonna. We see it in hockey all the time, and it's not gonna get any better here. So yeah, I'm with you, Evan. I don't understand how the lottery would stop tanking or de-incentivize you. It's It just doesn't make a lot of sense, and it sure didn't work this year.
And imagine being a Pirates fan in the last 3 years, and that includes the COVID year where they only played 50 games. The Pirates are 100 games under 500. Ooh. Imagine being a fan of a team and going like 141 and 241. Oh, I mean, that's, like I just don't see how this works. And, they've got a couple young prospects, but we've seen them and other teams before, unless they can put like 7 or 8 of them together, then they just trade them off and start all over again. We've seen Miami do that. We've seen, the A's. There's a bunch of teams. Like it's a real. The Reds, it's just a really sad tale. And I think at least with the Cubs, because of the spending capabilities, they're not in that same boat, or they're not. They will not. They'll have too much pressure to find themselves in that same boat. Whereas those other teams,
so? From where? Where not at the gate, not at the turnstiles. They did another.
Wasn't this the lowest attendance in 20 years or something this year?
But still,
lowest since '97, I believe.
Since 1997. Yeah.
Lowest since 1997. Still put him in the top 10 of.
Just put him 5th in the National League. Yeah,
5th in the National League. So,
but that's still money they're leaving on the table. I went to a couple of those games where it was like,
and that's the paid attendance too, because I did some of that math. Right, I mean, how many fewer people showed up? And if you believe, and I don't, but I don't believe Ricketts saying they get 70% of their revenue from game day activities, although they do get a lot, right? If you talk about everything they've invested in there locally. So if you take away the gate that they lose, and then you take away concessions at the ballpark and just all the spending that goes on around Wrigleyville, there's an inflection point at which saving money on payroll is absolutely going to cost them more, I think, in terms of game day revenue. And I don't know if they've crossed that, but I think they got awfully close. If you're looking at Ricketts kind of finally making the rounds a little bit more publicly, they are going to have Cubs convention again. There's at some point, and it's funny because I've noticed a giant uptick in people on Twitter talking about the Cubs reaching out to them about the ability to purchase season tickets, I think we've talked about that on here when I've been on before. I've shared that with other people. I mean, it's very obvious that their list isn't real in terms of how many people are on there. But over the last couple of years, there have been a whole lot more people who have gotten that opportunity, some of them multiple times.
Yeah,
they've come up, got back on it, and got it again. So when they're starting to bleed season ticket holders to the extent that they have, I think that's where you really talk about the trouble with that paid attendance.
And you get a lot of money for playing in the playoffs. Like there's a lot of extra revenue for that for teams. They generate. So, and then also they have a TV network and other things. I just think that the brand is too. The brand is not going, after winning the World Series for sure. The brand is not going to maintain itself if they are losing and not trying. I mean, even in the old days when the Cubs were bad, they would have a Sandberg and a Dawson and a Madison. And they had a star player, Sosa, right? They always had a star player. The problem they have right now is they don't have any star players. 0 star players on this team. 0 on, after the trade deadline last year. So that's the other thing about the intelligent spending. Sometimes it's a loss leader, for other things. But I don't expect the Cubs to fall into like Oakland A's, Pittsburgh Pirates, Cincinnati Reds territory where the attendance is like 600 people at a game. Paid attendance is like 2,400. But you can count the people because there's so few of them. It won't be like that, but I do think Evan's right that you can reach a point where that's every unfilled seat is money you're leaving behind. So,
and that's why you need to go out and trade for Ohtani, and then you go sign Senga as your top free agent pitcher, and now you've got Ohtani and Suzuki and Senga, and you can sell boatloads of advertising to the Japanese market on marquee, and you can and that, I mean. And I say that like not even really tongue in cheek, but I mean,
it's not.
There's a huge market that's available out there, and I mean, it's exciting for domestic viewers as well, right? I mean, again, just I know it's still a pipe dream, but if you want to talk about energizing a fan base, you swing a trade for a generational superstar like Shohei Ohtani, and he's playing at Wrigley every day. Well, now all of a sudden there's your star, right? There's somebody who
especially
alone
when he
will lift
high
some
fives
seats.
Trey Turner after a home run, right? I mean, that's
Yeah. It's the way to do it, you know. But I mean, you think about the difference, right? You talked about having an ace pitcher who can make that difference, but then you also talk about a team that lacks lefty power and a team that needs to put fans in the seats and a team that needs to get more revenue for their homegrown television network that they have. I mean, that's like, you want to talk about a magic bullet, that's it right there. That's worth a whole lot of prospects and whoever else you need to trade to make it happen.
And hey, you know what? You should have 2 stars at all times, minimum. 1 pitcher, 1 hitter. So Ohtani and Trey Turner fit the bill.
And a generational talent like that never hits the market, is never available. It's a weird circumstance of like horrible ownership and selling the team in Anaheim that's made this possible. You can't, if you have a chance, like you've got to take a shot.
Waiting for Juan Soto to become a free agent.
Right.
You know, that doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen.
And it is interesting, you know, and I mean, obviously we all assume, but I have to think, right, the fact that the Angels already agreed to his salary for next year, like as soon as the season was over, like that's a big giant sign that says here's his value. Now again, if you're the Cubs or anybody who trades for him, you've got to lock down an extension on that guy because you know, as we talked about, it does them no good to have him for a year and then watch him walk away. But you know, speaking of that's one of those where while it might be a loss leader on paper, you know, I think as we just talked about, you look at the things that he would generate just outside of strictly wins and losses, which again, I think even wins and losses the next few years of a guy, he's what, 28. So you could easily have another 5 to 6 prime seasons, one way or the other, depending on how that goes. And if he struggles as a pitcher, he's still a great hitter, or vice versa. So there's a little bit of built-in
and if he doesn't,
mitigation
then he's
there.
great at both. So
yeah, and if that's the case, it's incredible. But yeah, I mean, again,
mitigate the 46 home runs they gave up from the left side when they intelligently refused to spend money on their left fielder and gave him up for nothing 2 years ago.
But, you know, they got you know, they signed Jock Peterson.
Yes, they did, and then they gave him up for a minor leaguer.
Here's the thing, right? Speaking of that, and I always go back to this: the Cubs and Braves had almost identical records at the time they made that trade. I think they were only a half game different. Maybe the Braves were like slightly ahead of them. And there was a thought at the time that the Braves might sell. Now, in the time since then, the Braves went on to win a World Series and now are looked at as a potential dynasty again because they've got all of their young players. They just signed Spencer Strider to an extension. They've got all these other young guys signed to extensions. They made the huge trade, and then extended their first baseman right after letting Freeman go. And so now you're looking at the things that have happened. And I'm not saying, you know, hey, the Cubs would have done this if they had traded for a Jock Peterson type, right? But it's not a one-to-one comparison. But we do look at the Cubs as, okay, they've been selling off. They sold off all their stars. They didn't extend any of those guys when they were young. I mean, I guess Rizzo the first time. But it's a different deal. And you look at that Atlanta team, and they could they could probably extend Dansby Swanson. And then you look at them for the next 8 years, they've got their whole core together. It's just it's an interesting study in contrasts, and I would prefer to be a Braves fan right now based on their future. But
no kidding. And I guess if you're a Cubs fan or Cubs ownership, then you want to do some intelligent spending and you want to get an Ohtani, but you're afraid to give up all your prospects because you know you've just spent a lot of time acquiring them by trading everybody else you had. I think, you know, you explore. I mean, the Cubs have never done this really, so it's hard to suggest that they would. But how much less would you have to give up in prospects to get Ohtani if you were willing to take on Anthony Rendon's salary? I mean, he's a highly paid third baseman who's good when he's healthy, but he hasn't been healthy for several years now. Maybe playing in a playoff race back in the National League would rejuvenate his career. He certainly did well in Washington. And, you know, that would be a risk, right? Because he's going to get paid $30+ million for several more years. But that's got to be worth something to you would think it would be worth something to the Angels because they're kind of cheap. and really, in order for them to get over this whole, 3 stars and nothing else kind of with Trout and Rendon and Ohtani scenario they've gotten themselves into. If they're going to get rid of Ohtani, I'm sure they would love to also kind of start fresh and get rid of this salary. And he's on the hook. You'd be on the hook for, $38.5 million for 4 more years each year, or maybe they pay a part of that. But I wonder what that would save you in terms of, or maybe you say, look, we'll pay $20 million of his salary for the next 4 years. And what would that save you in terms of the prospect haul you have to give up? And would the Cubs actually, given the fact that the next couple of years, the Cubs really don't have much salary they have to worry about, right? They're going to lose Hayward and Hendricks after this season. So that's going to be $35 million they can not have to spend. So they probably have, and they're already $100 million under the cap, right? So, I mean, they've got, or not cap, but the luxury tax. So they have a lot of flexibility in that area, and that way they could also avoid giving up quite as many of their prospects and the fear of whatever the FOMO is that they're afraid of in trading people. I don't know. It's a thought. I mean, he's going to be 33 next year. It's not by any stretch. It doesn't mean that you're getting a great player back, but you are getting somebody who, I think could be serviceable and save you prospects.
Buy your way
you
out
just
of
trade
trading.
for Mike Trout. Get Trout, throw him in there. He's making a ton of money. You trade them in half. You put Trout in left. You bring Pete Crow Armstrong up. Suzuki, done.
We'll give him like Owen Cassie or something. Like we'll give him a prospect, right? Maybe we'll give him Adrian Sampson.
All right, last question for me. We're running out of time here already. Evan, last question for me. 2022 Cubs season. Did you have fun?
No. I did not. This felt like the longest season I can remember. I mean, gosh, some of those were slogs though. I mean, 18 and 19, even 20 for being a short season. I mean, the last several years have felt far longer than the normal, very long Major League Baseball season. But they're, outside of a few moments, this reminded me a lot of that 2014 season, right? And I'm hopeful that holds, right? Because we know what happened, and after that, they started finally making some moves. There are a few little things you can point to say, "Ooh, I like this over here. This was cool," but it was very unfulfilling. Things didn't quite, they were so bad early, and then they got just good enough at the end to kind of screw themselves out of a really good, because I would have felt better, honestly, about them getting a really great chance at a high draft pick, because if they can't lose that again, right? I mentioned that earlier. If they got a top 3 pick, they can't get that again the next year. They almost have to now go and be good because they're punished almost for it. So yeah, it was unfulfilling in many different ways. It was too easy to check out. And there were about 75 different players they used, and just no consistency. So I'm glad it's over, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what happens this winter, because I sincerely hope and I believe next season is going to be a little bit more fun.
Pat, do you have
I have 2 quick things to say. One, did you know that in 47 games, Anthony Rendon put up more WAR than Patrick Wisdom did 134 games? Just saying. And secondly, to Evan's point, I don't think I felt this detached from a Cubs team. Well, certainly not in the Epstein-Hoyer era. And going back, there might have been 1 or 2 seasons like post Sammy Sosa, like maybe 2012 or so, when I felt that way. But I don't know. They never tried to win this year, so that was frustrating, despite their claims to the contrary. And then they got off to the bad start, and it was just obvious that they were outmatched. And then at the trade deadline, they didn't maximize. I felt like they needed to maximize the pain because the pain had already been inflicted. Like we'd already gotten stabbed. At that point, it was just like, let's just get as much as we can for this. And then it felt like they kind of didn't do that. And that made the second half even more painful. And then they started winning, which, is great in some respects. But I also watched that. And to me, those wins were only enjoyable to the extent that the players that I thought would be around in the future were doing well. And when they were winning in spite of or without those players, it felt a little bit unsatisfying to me because that's just a win for win's sake with somebody I'm never going to see again. So that's not progress. That's just sort of dumb luck, I guess. But it was a rough season. It certainly was the least enjoyable 74 win season. We've had quite a few 74 win seasons over time where you could at least point to some stuff that went right and say, oh, that wasn't so bad, I guess. But this was not one of those seasons.
No, definitely not. And I echo your point, Evan, that I hope that this offseason isn't just lip service that they're going to try to compete, but actually we see some progress towards changing the product on the field. Because, yeah, man, it's it's a slog when the team is bad by design out of the gate, and this has been 2 years in a row now, and we can't do a third. They've got to turn it around. It is hard to watch at times. So hopefully we'll be back to talk all of the winter happenings as transactions happen, winter meetings, Cubs convention. We've got a lot coming up here in the off season, so make sure you stay subscribed to this podcast. And Evan, please remind our listeners where they can find all of your content on the internet.
Yeah, you can head on over to CubsInsider.com. Check it all out there. If you prefer to get it through the social media channels, certainly you can check us out at Real Cubs Insider on Twitter. Search Cubs Insider on Facebook as well. And if you go out to YouTube and you look for Cubs Insider, we've got a channel there with all kinds of fun stuff as well. So we're all over the place.
Excellent. Yeah, and we are we're also very thankful for our patrons over at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. That Patreon has helped us be ad-free for our 4th consecutive season. So thank you to all the folks that support us over there. And for those who can't support us financially, make sure you tell your Cub fan friends about the show. Make sure you show them how to subscribe to the podcast because, like I said, we're not going to be on a regular every week schedule going forward. We will come and podcast when there's news to be had and things to be talked about. So make sure you stay subscribed.
In the off season.
Exactly. We are in it now, yeah. So make sure that you stay subscribed and you never miss an episode because we will come to you with the news and the happenings as the off season progresses and the Cubs work towards rebuilding for 2023. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to call it a podcast. We're going to call it a season. Another one in the books. Thanks for joining us, Pat.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.